Hello to you all. Out of our comfort zone just a little, being down here. Out of our comfort zone without our tablecloths, without our lovely food and our beautiful glass of white and a red. But I'm sure on this occasion that we can cope. I'm going to blame David for being so popular. We have 110 attendees today, which is just absolutely fantastic. So thank you all for being here. I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of Eora Nation. My name is Kim Kellaway and I'm Head of Clients and Markets at HLB Man Judd and part of the Strategic Alliance of the ENFP community. And I would like to introduce you to the team. Daryl Swindells, Simon James, Aidan Smith, Kim Luong, I'm just checking to see who's here, Nicholas Guest, Charlotte Sandell, Mauricio Casas. These are our partners from HLB Man Judd, and we have a special guest today. Corey McGovern is one of our partners from Adelaide. Commonwealth Bank, we have Yvette Flynn, Bill Payne and Blake Sinclair. And from FAMS we have Pauline Keebar. How lucky we are today to have the amazing David Locke, Assistant Commissioner, ACNC. So I'd like us all to put our hands together and welcome David.
Well, thank you very much, Kim, for that lovely welcome. I too would like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and also their elders, past and present, and to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I'm delighted to be invited to speak at this event. A huge thank you to HLB Man Judd for laying this on, and also to FAMS and to CommBank as well. I followed the development of the group. I'm a member of the group on LinkedIn. That's probably no surprise to those of you who are connected to me on LinkedIn, because you probably think I'm a lunatic because I'm so active on some of the social media. But I think it's a great community of practice, and I really commend you for the work that you do in terms of bringing these groups together and in terms of trying to spread the message as well. What I'd like to do today is to talk to you about some of the things that are currently going on. I thought I'd give you a little bit of a flavour of what's happening at the ACNC. Now, the new Commissioner, Gary Johns, I think would be delighted to speak at a future event, and I know Kim's already approached him. He's not able to join me today because at 2 o'clock this afternoon he's got his first Senate estimates sitting the other side of the table. So I think he'd probably rather be here, but I'm sure he'll join you for future events. I'm also going to talk a bit about the review into the ACNC legislation. Some of you will be fully informed of what's going on there, others may not be. Some I know are putting in submissions, and people have told me that they're putting in submissions today, which is the final day for submissions. I'm hoping to stir you up on some of the issues that we're thinking about in the context of the review, so that you may go back to the office and send them an email if there's something that concerns you or that you think should be considered by the review panel. I also thought I'd talk about two of the current pieces of legislation before Parliament with regard to advocacy, really with regard to the foreign funding of organisations, which includes charities and not-for-profits. I'm going to, as far as I can, to my ability, try and explain really what the legislation's about and what it seeks to do. And what I will also do is just summarise really what the ACNC's submissions have been in respect of this legislation. Clearly, the legislation is a matter for government. As a public servant, my role is to administer legislation. It's not really to provide commentary on it. But the ACNC has put in submissions with regard to these two pieces of legislation. So I think I will really outline what we have said with regard to that. And then finally, I'm going to just talk a little bit about a compliance report which the ACNC will be publishing probably on Monday, I had hoped we'd be publishing it today and I would launch it today, but these things weren't meant to be, I'm afraid, so I think it will probably be Monday next week. But I'll just talk through really what some of the findings and issues are there as well. So, in terms of the ACNC, the new commissioner was appointed really just under 3 months ago in December. And he is making his first really public speech in terms of his vision for the organisation at the forthcoming Fundraising Institute conference on the 8th of March. Some of you may be at the conference, in which case there is definitely a session where he'll be talking. But what Dr. Johns is very keen to do is to actually find ways to better display the data that the ACNC has gathered over the last 5 years and to significantly improve the register of charities. And he wants to do that to better inform donors on the sector and to better inform donor decisions with regard to giving in particular. So you will see developments really, hopefully there'll be some changes to the register that will be through by the 30th of June this year. I'm sure that we'll be consulting on some of that and talking as those ideas develop. But I think one of his key priorities is to better understand the sector and to better use the data that we have with regard to the sector. There's been significant change also at the ACNC Advisory Board. So as well as Minister Sukkar appointing Dr. Johns, he's also appointed a number of new board members, and the most recent changes took place towards the end of last year. So 3 long-term board members of the ACNC, Professor Miles McGregor-Lowndes, who will be known to many in the room, who's not only Australia's preeminent academic on not-for-profits, but he's actually one of the world's, stepped down from the board. Gina Anderson, who will be known to some from her time as CEO of Philanthropy Australia and also at the Centre for Social Impact as Research Fellow, and also from Women's Community Shelters as well in New South Wales. And also Fiona McClay, who was the CEO of Justice Connect, which of course has the not-for-profit law team and was formerly Pilch, which will be known to some of you as well. So in their place we have Heather Watson, who is a partner at a law practice in Brisbane called McCulloch Robertson. She's also the chair of Uniting New South Wales and ACT and has a long history of working in the not-for-profit sector and understands the not-for-profit sector and charity law. We have David Piggott from Mission Australia, and I know we have some colleagues of David's here from Mission Australia today, who is the executive responsible for community and sector engagement. And we also have Heather Allen, who is the CEO of the Lung Foundation of Australia, which is a national charity based out of Brisbane. So I think you will see coming out of the ACNC some shift over the coming months and coming years. But fundamentally, irrespective of who is the commissioner and who is on the advisory board, their responsibility is to administer the legislation that the ACNC has and to operate that legislation to the best of their ability. And so the review of the ACNC legislation is extremely important because that really shapes the regulator and shapes what the regulator will do in the future, not just what we've done over the last 5 years. I think a little bit about the context that we're operating in and just a few perspectives from me. I think it's actually tough out there. Talking to charities as we do on a daily basis, running events like this or speaking at events like this really around the country, I think what we can see is that there are a number of issues that are going on at the moment, both in terms of legislative reform in different areas, the rollout of the NDIS, and the implications that that is having at the moment on organisations. But a few things that I wanted to just pick up on. Firstly, this issue of trust and confidence. I think what we've seen over many decades is actually some real sort of structural changes to how people engage with charities and not-for-profits. We're seeing it particularly with young people who may be less inclined to join political parties, less inclined to join trade unions, less inclined to be members of not-for-profit organisations as well. But I think what we see with younger people is a whole generation of people who are still incredibly passionate about the world that they're living in and invested in their future and also maybe their children's future as well. So what we're seeing is people very often associating with causes rather than necessarily associating with charities. And I think that raises a challenge to all organisations as to how you can operate in future, how you can mobilise the next generations of givers and volunteers and supporters in ways that perhaps you haven't had to do so in the past. What we're seeing with regard to trust, though, is on the 5th of February this year, there was the Edelman survey. Now, this is a global survey of trust. It doesn't just look at NGOs or not-for-profits or NPOs. It really looks at public attitudes of trust with regard to government, the media, business, a whole range of different institutions. And what we can see is that in many countries in the world, including Australia, there are declining levels of trust in a whole range of institutions. Now, as politics becomes more polarised, and certainly it is the case in Australia that has been happening over the last 10 years or so, we've seen declining public trust in government. But we've also seen in this survey, for the first time, public trust in not-for-profits go below 50%. It's dropped 4% in 12 months down to 48%. Now, maybe this is one survey, but what the ACNC has been doing since we were created is also commissioning reports to look at trust and confidence. We do that every 2 years. And our report in 2017 showed a similar decline in public trust and confidence. So I think there is an issue with regard to how the public are viewing not-for-profits. And actually what we've seen with regard to donations and the data that you provide through the annual information statements is that actually from 2015 to 2016, giving dropped as well. First time we've seen that. Dropped from 11.2 billion to 10.5 billion. So significant. And I think that mirrors people saying, well, actually, we're finding it harder to get donations, or if we are, we're actually having to spend more in order to be able to stand still. And the return on investment in fundraising is declining, I think, for many organisations. Now, of course, it's not consistent across the piece. Some charities are doing extremely well. But I think what we are seeing globally is actually things are getting tougher. Now, when I think about some of the context with regard to trust and confidence, there are issues that have been playing out. And I think it would be naive to think that these were the sole reasons or sole issues, that cause and effect. But I think it would also be naive to think that there was no relevance whatsoever. So over the last 4 years, we've had the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. And I think what that has shown is not just numbers of people doing wicked things and very harmful, appalling acts, but what we've seen also is wholesale governance failings, not just in the public sector, but also in the not-for-profit sector. Faith organisations, but not exclusively faith organisations. I do think that some of the issues that have attracted the media, and I think Aidan is going to talk a little bit about the Bergen report and the impact of that with regard to fundraising, but I do think, particularly in New South Wales, where this has been headline news at times, I do think some of the scandals involving parts of the RSL movement do not help, let's put it that way. And in very recent weeks as well, we've had the scandal in the UK, but clearly a global issue and a global matter with regard to Oxfam GB, where some of the most appalling things have been described there. And I think that it's very easy to think that's a British issue, or this is contained to that particular organisation. But certainly when you look at the research, public perceptions and the way that public assess some of this is sometimes not quite as sophisticated perhaps, or not quite as segmented as people may wish. I'm also going to talk about, as I said, the issues with regard to advocacy, and I think that this is important, not just because of the legislation that's going on, but I think it's important because we are, possibly within the next 14 months, at some stage there will be a federal election. you know, these issues with regard to advocacy are going to continue for a while. They're going to possibly escalate in the run-up to an election rather than necessarily calm down. So, firstly, the ACNC review. There's a line in the ACNC Act in 2012 that says there will be a review at 5 years. The review will be completed within 6 months. It will start at the 5-year anniversary of the ACNC, which was 3rd of December 2017, and will be concluded within 6 months. And then the report will be tabled to Parliament within 15 sitting days. I shared a platform with Christian Seibert from Philanthropy Australia, who was Minister David Bradbury's advisor when the legislation was going through. And he said the whole history of this was really that this was a concession to try and get the Greens to support the legislation through the Senate and the crossbench to support it through the House of Reps, and nobody really thought about how this would be carried out. But I do think that actually having a review of legislation at 5 years is really positive. We've seen it as a positive opportunity, not as a threat. We welcome it. We know that there's significant issues with the legislation. We know that actually the ACNC is very much a work in progress. We're proud of some of the things that we've achieved, but we think there's a huge amount more potential that hasn't been realised, and there's things that can be done much better. So we've taken a really proactive approach to that. Panel's been appointed, details there. There is a microsite that was set up, I think, at the start of last week. Happy for Kim to send the slides out, but if you Google ACNC legislation or ACNC, you'll see it. They've got an ad, so it's the first thing that appears if you Google ACNC. You can go on there, you can put a submission in. You only have until close of business today. It can be a short email. It doesn't have to deal with everything. But anyway, there we have it. So, closing date today. Panel were only appointed actually on about the 8th of December. So they've got a bit of a task ahead of them. They're doing face-to-face consultations, but these are by invitation. So they've tried to invite a cross-section of people from different organisations. They're also coming to speak and spend time with our professional users group, which I know you're on, Darryl, and others. They're spending time with our sector users group, which involves representation from right across the sector. But if you have strong views about this and would like to attend, I would encourage you, as I have other people, email them. They're running events in every capital city throughout March. And I know a number of people who have actually emailed them and then been invited straight away to the event. So I don't think there's a hidden agenda, but that's how they've decided to do it. It has to be tabled within 15 sitting days. They've said they'll do the report by the 31st of May. My scheduling, I think that means early September. What next? Well, is the government going to prioritise legislative review of this in the lead up to an election? My guess would be it's fairly unlikely, but presumably the government will respond, and then we'll wait and see. But that's not to say it's not important. I do think it's important. So there's no discussion paper has been issued on this, but they have issued some terms of reference. I've set them out here. I won't go through them. But what they're asking for is, they're saying it's about evaluating the suitability and effectiveness of the acts. I don't think you can do that without actually assessing the organisation and performance to some extent. But I don't think it's an ANAO type review. I think that will come, but I don't think this is actually it. And again, I would welcome that. But they've asked to look at the objects. They've asked to look at the effectiveness of the framework, the powers and functions that the Commissioner's got, and whether any amendments are required in order to enable the achievement of the objects or to equip the Commissioner for known or emerging issues. So it's pretty broad, really. It's tell us what you think, isn't it, about the ACNC or about the ACNC legislation. We were conscious that actually, because there wasn't a discussion paper, and because the terms of reference are pretty broad, we've been working on this for a while because we've had drawers of issues that we've got with the legislation that we would like fixed. So we put in a submission quite early on the 25th of January, and we published that straight away. You can see that from the ACNC website, but also if you go to that microsite, you can see the submissions. You'll see the ACNC submission, also the ACNC review, the ACNC Advisory Board submission. A few others are up there. So when I looked about 15 minutes ago, there were still only 32 were published. But of course, most are going in today, and others are sending stuff through today. We've made 40 recommendations. Most of them are technical issues. Most of them are not terribly contentious issues. They're improvements, or they're things that we know don't work. The switch on, switch off of the arrangements with ASIC, the appalling issue with the ASIC register not being updated, and the banks and financial institutions going through that. That's caused so much pain for charities. We flagged sort of a whole range of these issues. But I thought what I would concentrate on is just, I think, 7 or 8 that I think are sort of key recommendations from us, and I'll just quickly talk you through some of those. It was a pretty open suggestion with regard to the objects. It's been universally unpopular, but I'll talk a little bit about that. Secrecy provisions, the register, so I'll go through some of these issues. We think that the objects that the ACNC were given in 2012 are sound. They were given by Parliament, really following heavy lobbying from the sector. I've spoken to you before about them. I rarely do a speech where I don't really talk about the objects, because for us they have actually been a touchstone. They've shaped the kind of regulator that Susan, myself and the team have tried to build. So we think public trust and confidence. We think, irrespective of the fact that I've just talked about that declining, we think doing our best to maintain and support that is important. We're only a bit player in that, but we think we do have an important role. The most significant players are yourselves, really, how you govern your charities and how you run your organisations. The media and others obviously play a role. The support we think is important, and the red tape we think is still only a partially delivered promise to the sector, and we think that that's critically important as well. What we have set out, which really mirrors what I was talking about in respect of Dr. Johns, is a suggestion that consideration be given to promoting the effective use of resources of not-for-profit entities and enhancing the accountability of not-for-profit entities to donors, beneficiaries. Now, what this is about is the use of data and the register. What Dr. Johns has said he doesn't want is any new powers or any new authority really behind that. But he thinks it would be better to have something explicit with regard to that, and I'm happy to deal with that under questions. We are very limited at the moment with what we can put on the register. You go to the register, not only is it painfully slow, it's excruciatingly slow. That is being fixed as we speak. That will all be changed. I'm changing the whole platform it's on, and that will all be improved by the 30th of June. But also, it looks very boring. It looks very much like a compliance tool, really. You might use it as part of a degree of due diligence. Have they filed? Are the accounts there? You might look for the constitution, but actually it doesn't really give you a flavour of what the charity is doing at all. And there's many things that we can't even put on there. So the legislation, officials in Treasury determined what would go on the register, and that's prescribed in the legislation, so changing it has been very difficult, it's been impossible. But things like the charitable purpose, maybe that might be useful. Things like the legal structure of the organisation. Things like whether it has DGR or not might be useful if you want to actually give money to a charity or search by charities that you want to actually donate to, particularly up at the end of the financial year. So there's a lot of things that we think just weren't thought about in the rush, and we would like those included. We've also suggested that actually, if there's information that we gathered through the annual information statement, then we should be able to display that. At the moment, all we can do is display that as a PDF document you click onto, and that, to me, seems a little bit silly. And also, there may be other information that charities would like on there and want to provide, not that the ACNC would require, but that they want to provide, such as, for example, you're a member of the Fundraising Institute, you're a member of ACFID and you sign up to their self-regulatory code. You've got these accreditations that actually show that what you're doing is already independently assessed. You might want to link through to other materials or other registers. We think that we should be able to do that. Whereas at the moment, the legal advice I've got is that even if charities ask, even if charities want to do that, and one of the things that drives some of the companies limited by guarantee insane is, why is the company secretary not on there? The company secretary is not on there because I can't put the company secretary on there, because I need to change the legislation. So there is some stupid changes that we think are needed with regard to the register. Another change that we have signalled, and I've spoken about this before, and I've spoken about it to the Senate repeatedly, is the secrecy provisions. So when the ACNC was set up, the secrecy provisions that the tax office has were pretty much mirrored in our legislation. But we're not dealing with your personal tax affairs. We're actually dealing with information about organisations that are established for the public benefit. And so there is a degree of accountability that we need to have for our actions, and also there's a degree of transparency about some of this stuff that needs to be cleared up. So we believe, for example, at the conclusion of an investigation, we should be able to publish, if it's in the public interest to do so, a summary of what our findings were and what action we took or didn't take and the reasons behind that. And quite often that will be that we looked into the issues and we found that they weren't, you know, the allegations weren't substantiated, and actually we don't believe that this is the case. But we think that at the moment we can't even say what we've done. So we revoke a charity. I can't tell you that the board members were convicted of fraud with regard to this charity, and then one of them goes to the media and says we just forgot to file a form. I mean, it's really just a silly situation to be in. And in terms of our accountability to the sector and to the community, I think it's appalling, because you can't judge whether we're being proportionate or heavy-handed or light touch. And actually, I don't think there's any lessons that can easily be learned by the sector either. So we're looking for some changes really in respect of that. And one is relates to, as I said, the second one relates to if we revoke a charity or we run an investigation. The first one, we think there'll be circumstances sometimes, perhaps occasionally, where a registration decision, it may be in the public interest to disclose that. So, for example, we may register a charity, and this is really at the boundaries of what is charitable, but actually what it's doing is really setting some form of precedent for the sector. There may be an issue that is so publicly in the domain, in the public domain, and the registration applications in the public domain, that there may be some interest in actually publishing that. So in the UK, for example, I was involved in a number of decisions where we really developed charity law as a result of the decisions. So there was no head of charity about protecting the environment in the UK. There was no head of charity about promoting equality and diversity. But actually some of the registration decisions that the Commissioner took actually developed the law in that area. And we think that there would be some value in limited circumstances in doing that. We also think there will be some circumstances where, not just at the conclusion of an investigation, but actually during the course of it, we may need to make some public comment. At the moment, we get calls from journalists. We understand you've opened an investigation into this. We've been told by X that you've opened an investigation into this charity. My guys have to say we cannot confirm or deny whether we have an investigation open. Now, if it's already in the public domain, it does seem silly. And there will be situations where actually there's a public issue that does need to be addressed. So if you look at the Oxfam and safeguarding issues that are playing out in the UK, the charity regulator there has said, we have approached all the international development charities, we've opened these investigations, we've approached all the international, and we've sought these assurances, and we're getting these reporting. Now actually that protects the public trust, that gives the public confidence that actually somebody's doing something, and it's not that this is going, whereas at the moment we can't say anything about any of that. So we think that there needs to be some degree of loosening, but we're also conscious though, if you announce you have an investigation into a charity, what's the impact on that charity? Well, the potential impact could be very significant in terms of donations, in terms of concerns, but the reality may be that actually you uncover nothing, or it's given a clean bill of health. So I wouldn't advocate doing this loosely, and I think there need to be specific provisions drafted, but I think there needs to be a little bit of common sense applied there. Another issue we've picked up that we've raised in the submission, and I hope to raise with the board. At the moment, individuals are disqualified from being a board member of a charity if you've been removed as a director by the ACNC Commissioner, or if you're disqualified under the Corporations Act provisions. So you're an undischarged bankrupt, you have convictions for acts of dishonesty, or you've breached certain significant Corporations Act obligations. But actually, we think that there should be a slight broadening of this. Again, we think it needs to be caveated and cautious. But we think that it seems perverse that people with convictions for terrorism or terrorism financing or for money laundering are not actually prevented from being board members of charities. Now, I think that's a pretty high bar, but we think that that's important. We also think that there may be certain relevant offences as well that are also important. So we think that if you have a conviction for a child sex offence, you should be disqualified from being a board member of a charity that may have access to children, be working with children. You are actually not. We think that if you have convictions for animal cruelty, maybe you should be disqualified from being a board member of an animal refuge that you're running out of your home. You are not. So we do think that you need to be careful. I believe in rehabilitation. And of course, many charities are working with people, with convictions. And I think if you look at Aboriginal communities and you look at the disproportionality of some of these measures can be, I think you have to be very careful. But effectively, what we're saying is, we think that there should be certain provisions, and there should be waivers that can be granted, and there needs to be, a tight definition and rights of appeal in respect of this. One of the other things that we flagged as well is about use of charitable assets. So we revoke a charity, we undertake an investigation, we find that there's really serious breaches, we revoke the charity status, we say that we've revoked the charity, we can't tell you why, but we say we've revoked the charity. It carries on running, carries on calling itself a charity, says we never wanted to be registered with you anyway, we just came over by accident in the tax office. We don't stuff the tax concessions. Well, actually, we don't think that that's satisfactory. We don't think that the community would expect that to be satisfactory. Now, there are a whole range of jurisdictional reasons as to why that may be the case at the moment, but Canada's dealt with it, New Zealand's dealt with it, and we think it can be dealt with. So in Canada, there is a revocation tax. You get revoked, you've got 12 months to either apply the funds in furtherance of the purposes or to apply them in furtherance of your dissolution provision. So same or similar charity, if that. Any money that's left over at the end of that is taxed 100% by the government. So it's a pretty strong incentive to do it. The alternative is in Canada, is in New Zealand's model, where again you've got 12 months, and if you don't, then any money left over is taxed as income. So there's other ways to do it, but we think that through tax rules you can actually do something about this. Now, in reality, the State Attorney Generals have got jurisdiction over these funds as protectors of charities. I've struggled every single time to get State Attorney Generals to engage. So I do think that actually fundamentally there are broader issues really that need to be addressed if we want a really good, comprehensive coverage, and that is about a limited referral of powers. But whenever I say that, people sigh and say, you're a Brit, you don't understand that that's impossible. But actually, it was possible for corporations, it was possible for the business community. Why should it not be possible for not-for-profits? There are provisions in the Corporations Act that do apply to public companies, which are, of course, companies limited, include companies limited by guarantee. They require you have 3 directors, a minimum of 3 directors, and 2 of which are resident in Australia. So that already applies to the 7,500 charities that are companies limited by guarantee. It applies to some of the incorporated associations because there are measures in their legislation, but it doesn't apply to all charities. So I've had applications from charities where there is a sole director as an individual that's running this. That is not a good model of governance. Or where we've got sole individuals, all resident overseas. It's not a good model of governance. If you're looking to take regulatory action, you're very limited. So we think actually there need to be changes, and we're suggesting some changes there. Clearly, it can't apply for basic religious charities if that exemption applies, and I'll talk about that. There's already a reporting obligation just like this for auditors to ASIC when they're carrying out an audit of a charity that is a company limited by guarantee. There is no such duty on auditors to notify the ACNC, and we think that that should be mirrored across the piece. So those are the key recommendations that we've made, but as I said, there's other issues as well to be resolved. The policy issues that are really broader than us, and it's for others to comment on. Is this actually a charity commission? If so, why don't we call it the Charities Commission? Why are we calling it the Not-for-Profit Commission? Is the intent that the Gillard government had still valid to at some stage expand this to include some not-for-profits? In which case, shouldn't there be at least some roadmap or indication of what that could look like? Now, there are 7,500 charities that are companies limited by guarantee. There are 7,500 other companies limited by guarantee that are not-for-profits but not charities. If you're looking at actually broadening this, that seems to be a fairly sensible starting point. You may then look at possibly some of the other incorporated associations. 137,000 incorporated associations registered with the states. 25,000 of those are charities. The rest are not. So again, you may make it optional possibly with regard to organisations with legal structure, but it's for others to comment on. The Commission isn't bidding for more work in that area at all. I think other issues, the exemption that was given to basic religious charities means that those organisations do not have to provide financial reporting, and the governance standards do not apply. There's 18,000 charities we have registered with us that are religious organisations. 8,000 of those are basic religious charities. Now, our submission is that the arrangements have worked okay, but we don't comment on the policy intent behind that. Some are basically saying that actually the exemption isn't justified post the Royal Commission. Others are actually saying it should be broadened out to encompass a whole class of small charities, not just religious charities. The one thing I would say about the latter suggestion is that if the governance standards, the basic governance standards do not apply, then the regulator can take no action in respect of abuse in those organisations. There is pretty much nothing we can do. We will be pretty much impotent. And if you base that threshold very low, you will actually find there are tens of thousands of charities where the regulator has got no jurisdiction to act. Now, most of our investigations are actually into large and medium charities, but about 29% have been into small charities. Some of the issues at the most extreme end of the spectrum, where we've uncovered that there are people with very serious convictions with regard to children involved in charities, where there are concerns about the flow of funds overseas, where there are concerns about radicalisation. Some of these are very small charities. So again, I think you just need to think about this in that context. So there's a few broader issues that need to be considered. Now, I'm conscious I've been talking for quite a long time, so I'm going to try and speed up a bit. The two pieces of legislation that I think you need to know about. The first is the Electoral Funding and Disclosure Reform Bill. So this is now before the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. It is still accepting submissions up until the 9th of March, and it's going to report on the 28th of March. But effectively what this does is establish registers for key non-party political actors, and it actually means that there needs to be reporting to the Australian Electoral Commission in respect of any political expenditure. Now, some of the concern we've got is around this definition of political expenditure. So when you look at political expenditure in the context of this, it is effectively any money that any organisation, so think of this as a not-for-profit, any money that a not-for-profit spends publicly expressing views on a political party or candidate who may be standing for the House of Reps or Senate. Now, you will advocate for your cause, you're already not supposed to support or oppose a particular candidate, so you may be okay with that. But the second head is any public expression of views on an issue that is before or likely to be for electors at an election. Now, if you are campaigning on international aid, if you're campaigning on disability, if you're campaigning on housing, if you're campaigning on almost any cause in the room, I would suggest that they may be issues that may be likely to come before electors at an election. In which case, you have to register, you have to pay the fees, and you have to report to the Australian Electoral Commission, and if you don't, there are very serious consequences. There are already existing requirements for third parties to report political expenditure over the threshold of $10,000. So this is already the case. And 9 charities, including World Vision, some other household name charities, did actually report to the AEC. So there's been between about 15 and 9 charities each year. But that's because the definition didn't include that second head. So during the course of the hearings, what's actually transpired is that in September last year, the legislation was actually amended. And most of us didn't really understand this or follow this. But the legislation was amended in September, this comes into effect in March, and this changes that definition of public expenditure to include the second head. So during the course of the hearings, you may have seen David Crosby and others have gone before the committee, and the committee's been saying, but there is no change. So thousands of charities are in breach, and people have got a bit mixed up with this. At the moment, very few charities are actually required, but come March, this will be the case, that many, many more charities will be required to register. And actually, if the legislation goes through, there will be further consequences as well. Because actually, report within 16 weeks of your year end, you have to require submission of an auditor's report in respect of this. And if you don't, if you inadvertently, not willfully or deliberately, if you inadvertently fail to report receipt of any donation over $250 from a non-allowable donor, so from an overseas donor, then the financial controller of the charity is subject to a sentence of 10 years in prison. So the legislation poses the obligation on the financial controller, which may be an employee or it may be the treasurer, and the sentence is up to 10 years imprisonment. So strict liability, and what it means in reality is that if you are getting donations over $250,000 and you could possibly be in this territory, you need to get statutory declarations from every single donor in order to be safe.
Sorry, is it $250 or $250,000?
$250. And if you and that could be in small donations throughout the year. So that's in total from a donor. It doesn't have to be in one donation.
What's this, sorry, it's not tough questions, what does the stat deck have to say?
The stat deck has to reaffirm that you are an Australian national or an Australian resident, that you're not effectively a non-allowable donor. But the issue that charities are raising is all of this happens after the end of the financial year, so it's all retrospective. The thresholds are incredibly low, and actually the consequences are so serious. This is the reason that so many people have been raising issues with regard to this. This is the reason that the Catholic Church, the IPA, ACOS, all the, lots of charities right across the political spectrum have been making representations with regard to this. So there may be changes to it, but this is what the consequence is. Our submission, as good public servants, the bill places an unnecessary burden on charities. The very significant and punitive penalties for non-compliance will deter volunteering. The bill introduces legislative inconsistency and is unnecessary because already charities cannot undertake political campaigning. They can only undertake campaigning in furtherance of their purposes, and there already is a line that is largely understood by the vast majority of charities. And the effect of this will be to reduce advocacy on the not-for-profit sector. So that's the first piece of legislation. There is then another piece of legislation as well, this Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme. Now, all of this really flows from interference in the US presidential election, concern about political interference, Senator Dastiari and some of the scandals that have gone on. So there is some cross-party support to try and actually address some of these issues, but my concern is not the policy at all. It is actually what are the practical implications on charities. So this piece of legislation actually provides that charities, in addition to the reporting to the AEC and any reporting to the ACNC and any other reporting you may have as well, if you are intending to conduct an activity on behalf of a foreign principal, so again a different test, then you need to register with the Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs and the separate reporting to them. Now that looks fine because activity on behalf of a foreign principal, well, we're not going to do that. But the challenge is when you look at the definition of undertaking activities on behalf of foreign principals, this is very broad. This is very broad, and we've raised issues with regard to that. So in our submission, which is public, we have said international aid charities, part of an international grouping, drawing attention to a transboundary issue such as the environment or global poverty, we think they could fall within this. Also research charities involved in presenting to international forums, and the support, we think they could be pulled in this. So we think that there is real issues with how this is drafted at the moment. So not only do we have the issue about additional reporting, but also, again, what's mirrored in this is the sentences and the nature of the offences are all strict liability and they're extremely serious. So again, they go up to 7 years in prison. So the Secretary has the power to investigate whether a person should have registered, so whether a charity should have registered under this legislation. There's strict liability and there's very serious penalties in the legislation. So again, what we've said is the definition of undertaking an activity on behalf of a foreign principal is imprecise and it is extremely broad. The difficulties inherent in charities meeting the requirements of the bill and the risks attached to non-compliance mean it's likely that this will effectively mean that charities are less likely to engage in public discourse. And so some of the concerns we've raised are not just about the provisions and actually the consequences, but what is the broader impact going to be in terms of the environment for charities, particularly over the next 12 months. So that's effectively why people are concerned about this, and as I said, there's ongoing debate. I mentioned the report very briefly that we're going to publish on Monday. What we're trying to do, because of the issues with the secrecy provisions, is try and be a bit more transparent about what we're doing in the compliance space. We have about 17 compliance officers out of a staff team at the moment of about 90. So it is only part of what we do. A lot of what we do is about the education, the support, the registration, but we think it is an important part. So what we've done is report on our activity throughout 2017, and we've also, because charities said last time that it was helpful, we've published a number of anonymised case studies as well, so you can see actually how we're responding or how we're engaging. But if you look at the headline figures, we had just under 1,700 complaints, concerns raised with us. Many of these from members of the public or from people involved in charities, but actually 13% came from other government departments. We actually ran we opened 202 investigations last year, and we finalised 82, so there's a number that are still ongoing. We revoked 26 charities following investigations where we found there were serious breaches, and we thought that was the appropriate action. But you'll see there are 16 charities where we entered into compliance agreements, and there's one where we entered into an enforceable undertaking. The difference between these, this is where charities are working with us to address the issues. We will enter into an enforceable undertaking where the charity is what's called federally regulated, so we have jurisdiction. If it isn't, then we will do a compliance agreement, but they are largely similar, only the enforceable undertaking is enforceable through the court. With a compliance agreement, if there were breaches, then we would look to revoke, so there's different consequences. We issued final warning notices telling charities we would fine 311 charities. These are charities who have persistently failed to file, and we prioritised large charities or charities that have always failed to file on time, been persistent late filers, or even charities where we revoke them for failing to file. They apologise, come back on the register, and then the first time they go, they fail to file again. So those are the sorts of organisations where we're sort of using that. That's a copy of the report. A little bit more information. We issued 49 notices to banks and other financial institutions and third parties requiring them to provide information to the ACNC, so we will very often do that if we have an investigation. I mentioned the 311 charities that had the penalty notice. We actually then enforced in respect of 115 of those. So most of them, once they get the final disconnection notice, they do actually file everything, but some, even at that point, don't, and the fines go up to 4,500, so they're not insignificant for large charities. And you'll see that in terms of double defaulters, charities that failed to file 2 years in a row, we revoked 780 last year. So there's quite a few interesting facts and figures, but probably more interesting will be the case studies and a bit of the flavour that comes through in terms of the action that we do. Okay, I'll talk for an hour.
Sorry, you've got another Brit presenting to you, but don't worry, I'm doing the good part. Now, I'm not here to talk about the Boardroom inquiry. For those who've read it or looked at it, it's 700 pages long, and I'm only here for it, so that's not going to go through that. But what I want to, it's been touched upon before, David, Darryl, is about what we're looking at fundraising appeals. Part of the Boardroom inquiry looked at and made some recommendations for each of the fundraising appeals, including the single body, because we've got various states that require different things. But also I want to pose some questions to you in this room as a result of reading through this inquiry, because what I've seen, there's a Charitable Fundraising Act, there's a regulation, and there's conditions attached to that. Okay, and part of the Boardroom inquiry said, look to the board. Now we know boards have responsibilities as directors, and that's come out of cases like the Central case, where the board can say, oh, well, it's the auditors look after that, or it's the finance team look after that. The board have to assess certain financial literacy. Also with this, it's looking at the literacy of fundraising, understanding the definition of fundraising appeals. One of the recommendations was training for management and directors on that. Definitely, I've spoken to a number of charities, but okay, are you doing fundraising appeals? And they say, no, we're not out in the street collecting money. But when you look at the definition of a fundraising appeal, it's actually much wider than that. It's pretty much, I'm not reading much for it, but it's pretty much like, if you're receiving any money or property, if before the course of that, the person represents that it's the purpose of activity or enterprise which includes a charitable purpose. Which includes quite a lot, it's quite a broad definition. We've looked at accounts to see what other organisations are doing in the not-for-profit sector, and what we're seeing is there's inconsistencies is what people are saying are fundraising appeals. So that some are coding requests, some aren't coding requests. Some are disclosing fundraising appeals as one big appeal, others disclosing as separate appeals. One of the other things with Boardroom inquiry is looking at how the money's spent. So you receive some money, and it's for a charitable purpose, and that's spent a charitable purpose. But does your accounts package show that trail, that you can actually see that what that dollar has been spent on? Now, a lot of charities in the past have said, yeah, we've got the money, we know we spent it. But I think when you look at the report, it's going further than that. You actually have to show that audit trail that this dollar received for this purpose has gone out and been spent on this purpose. Do the accounts packages can cope with that? It's something that it's the Department of New South Wales, it's the Department of Fair Trading that look after it just now. I, in all my experience, haven't come across any charities that have been queried what they've been putting in their accounts up to recently in relation to the charitable fundraising disclosures. It's something that think with the Boardroom inquiries really brought it to light that it is significant, it's important, it's legislation, and it's something that you all should be, the boards should all be aware of. Do you have a checklist to monitor compliance? There's the Act, the regulation, the conditions. There's the conditions especially go into a lot of detail of stuff that you've got to do if you are fundraising, what your organisation's got to do, what the fundraising staff and volunteers have got to do, and then certain disclosures that have to be made in the accounts and what the auditors have to do as well. But do many organisations have a checklist to make sure that they're complying with all that? Do the accounts have to have a sign-off from CEO or a director or something of appropriate authority to say that all the accounts show a true and fair view of fundraising appeals and that the controls are adequate? There's a couple of other statements as well as to draw your attention to. Again, if someone's signing off on that, do they know that the controls are adequate? Do they know that they can expenditures showing fundraising appeals? Is it, what is a fundraising appeal? Is it one broad appeal? Is it lots of different appeals that you're doing every year? I think this is brought to attention that there's quite a lot of things that people have to be aware of, and now this is legislation which lots of people haven't been paying attention to in the past, but part of the disclosure part, it's a case of, oh yeah, it's looked after the finance team and the auditors. But I strongly recommend that you have a look at what you're doing, look at your controls, speak to the people in charge of fundraising and finance to find out how they're making sure that there is compliance with the Act and the regulation and the conditions. So hopefully we'll get to the stage where it will all be unified, and part of that process will be looking at some of these definitions, because they are quite vague in interpretation, and look at the other states, what they're saying, and bring it together as one, which will be easier to follow and understand. But for the time being, that hasn't happened. The existing legislation is in place, so I think it's very important that you have a look at it and make sure you are compliant and just ask any questions that you do have it.
Yvette Flynn from CBA, looking after the non-for-profit sector banking. Just want to thank Aidan for giving us an update, and I think that's a space to watch. Just wanted to give you a quick plug. CBA is providing a NDIS Changemakers Forum, which is going to be held, I know it's short notice, on the 9th of March. I've got 10 free spots. I'll just tell you a little bit about it, and if you'd like to put up your hand, Blake will do a whip around the room and grab your business card if you'd like to take a spot, and you can bring a friend. So we've put it together with our non-for-profit strategy team, and it's going to be down at our innovation lab, and we recognise that the NDIS has brought about significant change, and that comes with significant challenges that you're all facing. So we've brought internal and external partners to bring information and share their strategies for a sustainable organisation. And just to give you a bit of a thought about what we're doing for the day, they've developed in collaboration with the sector, exploring how you can engage with your clients in more meaningful ways, continue building commercial capability, explore new possibilities around service delivery. We'll have NDIS update from Antonia Albanese, and we'll have different streams sessions focusing on varying areas of your organisation. So everything from customer centricity and innovation on culture, cyber security, sustainable business strategy, developing effective leaders, customer satisfaction, and characteristics of an agile organisation, which I think is going to be quite important. So there's 10 spots up. If you'd like one, put your hand up. Blake's going to come and grab your business card. I'll give you a quick agenda to take with you, and we'll email you the invitation this afternoon. So that's enough from me. We're going to do the business card draw.
Yep.
Kim's the barrel girl.
Yep. Many hats, the barrel girl for many years. Are we all good?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. We'll get David to draw the first one, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, is our ENFP Boardroom Briefing program. And 2018 is in here. So we've been going from 2011 to 2018. So we've got some save the dates for you, so you'll know what our calendar year looks like. Our next event is to be held on the 5th of April here at HLB Man Judd upstairs. So we may be able to get ourselves back into our boardroom, and that's the launch of the pro bono salary survey. The 19th of June and 14th of August will be held at the Commonwealth Bank, and then back the 16th of October and Christmas party with us. Again, thank you all so much for your time. I look forward to seeing you on the 5th of April. Thank you.